Good morning and welcome back to Day 3 of the International Competition Network Annual Conference 2026. As we continue our conversations, today's sessions will further explore how competition authorities can strengthen capacity, enhance effectiveness, and leverage the right tools in an evolving global and digital landscape. Before the program begins, please proceed to the registration area to confirm your attendance and verify your seat assignment. You may also take this time to connect with fellow delegates from across our global competition community. The program will begin shortly. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Catching everyone's attention. Good morning, everybody. I would like to request for everyone to please take your seat and settle down as we are getting started right now. Good morning, everyone, and a pleasant day to all of our distinguished guests joining us here on ICN, as well as everyone else joining us, watching us right now from all around the world. Welcome back to Day 3 of the International Competition Network Annual Conference 2026. How is everybody this morning? Are we doing good? Feeling great, excited for what is in store for the entire day? Well, I certainly hope so. It is my absolute pleasure and honor being with all of you today. I'm your host. My name is Jelly Victor. Now, yesterday, our discussion centered on the impact of digital transformation. how it continues to reshape markets, challenge enforcement, and push agencies to be more agile, coordinated, and forward-looking, from evolving risks in digital ecosystems to strengthening agency impact. Day 2 highlighted the urgency of adapting to a rapidly changing landscape. Now, today, we build on that momentum by turning our focus to agency capacity, effectiveness, and tools, exploring how competition authorities can better equip themselves to respond to the challenges with clarity, capability, and confidence. Once again, we are joined by a distinguished community of regulators, policymakers, and experts from across jurisdictions, all contributing to meaningful dialogue and shared progress. Just like yesterday, before we begin, here are a few quick reminders for all of our on-site participants. Kindly keep your mobile phones on silent mode. Thank you. Next, please remain seated during sessions and minimize movement in the hall. And finally, should you need any assistance whatsoever, our Secretariat team is ready to help. And with that, we continue our shared journey of collaboration and innovation. Let us begin. We're going to start it off this morning with a very special project, Plenary. That is our first session for today, promoting competition in food and agriculture markets. This discussion brings into focus a sector that is both fundamental and highly dynamic, food and agriculture markets, and the critical role of competition policy in ensuring that these markets remain fair, efficient, and resilient. As economies continue to face pressures from supply chain disruptions, market competition or concentration, and evolving global demands, competition authorities are increasingly called upon to take a more proactive role. Through market studies, value chain analysis, and advocacy to promote better outcomes for both producers and consumers. Drawing from the ICN special project, this session will highlight practical tools, real-world experiences, and policy approaches that support more competitive and inclusive food and agriculture markets, particularly across developing and middle-income economies. Now, to guide this important conversation, we are joined by our moderator, Mr. Simon Roberts of the Competition Commission, South Africa. A round of applause for him, please. He is joined by our distinguished speakers, Ms. Farha Nabiha of the Malaysia Competition Commission. We also have joining us Ms. Nathalie Jalabert of France. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Bonjour, mademoiselle. And Mr. Eduardo Gonzalez of the National Competition Commission of Paraguay. Let's give them all a round of applause, please. And over to you, Mr. Roberts. Thank you.
Mabuhay, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, to be moderating this panel. Just to clarify, I'm an NGA. I was at the Competition Commission again in the past, and maybe I will be, who knows. But I'm an NGA at the University of Johannesburg, and I've been involved in the special project on food and agriculture. It's a great pleasure to be here with such a great panel. Now, we've got 45 minutes, and although we've started 20 minutes late, I've been told we still have 45 minutes. So we're going to use the time, and we want to make it very interactive. So lots of agencies have contributed to the special project. It's chaired by, I should say, by the authorities of Kenya and South Africa. Lots of authorities have contributed, NGAs, and we want to give an opportunity for people to engage in this discussion. It also feeds through to a breakout session where there's going to be engagement on some of the key questions, including mapping out what the priorities are for the way ahead. I had some slides, and I'm not sure how I'm going to control them from here. I'm going to skip over some of them so that we don't take up too much time, but how am I going to control them? Jocille was going to do it for me. The first one is just a stock take to remind people or to inform people of what the special project was doing. So second slide, very quickly. It started off checking how important were food and agricultural markets for authorities. It was after the Russia invasion of Ukraine and the big price spikes, and it was really striking how many authorities had actually undertaken market surveillance, price monitoring, inquiries, advocacy. They had extended their role beyond competition authorities to be markets authorities, even where they didn't have market inquiry powers. They'd had to respond. Thanks, that's great. Green is for the next. Okay, thanks. So they had stepped up and they had seen the need and they had responded even though this was outside of normal roles in some cases. Other authorities had powers to do this and we wanted to draw on the experience that they had engaged with. We then built on that in the following year, going into more detail in terms of developing best practices, looking at guidelines and toolkits, and that's where we are now. There are draft papers. South Africa has led a paper on price monitoring, which we discussed also in the breakout session. We've done deep dives on global traders and on the poultry sector, and we're looking at how inquiries have been used for advocacy purposes. So those are all things that are coming up, and we're going to talk about these issues today. So in terms of price monitoring, as I said, many agencies, many more than we had thought, had undertaken this, and we wanted to raise questions of the data and the methodologies that were used. There's a very big diversity of experiences and practices, what methods have been adopted in terms of the tracking and how they were disseminated. We're going to hear from two authorities on the panel, and also I'll invite comments from the floor. When we did this, I don't think we thought that the next shock of this magnitude is going to be coming down the line. And I feel like we're sitting on the beach and there's a tsunami off there. Because fertilizer prices right now are at the same levels as they were in 2021, 2022. And if I looked at rice prices, because we're in the Philippines, there was about a 6 to 12 month lag between fertilizer prices doubling and a 50% increase in rice prices. Fertilizer prices now, of the main nitrogen fertilizer, urea, have doubled. And rice is very fertilizer intensive. So what we're doing now, I think, is preparing us for 12 months' time. We may be sitting here saying, people are going to be asking us to explain why is there a competition issue. And of course, there isn't on the face of it, because this is a supply shock. But the transmission mechanisms, and particularly the adjustment, if it's a shock that flows through, then the adjustment will be faster. It'll be painful, very painful, but it'll be faster. But of course, if markets don't work very well, then that adjustment process is very delayed, and that has a bigger scarring effect on the economy, and this is really, really important. So I feel like this is going to be critical in terms of what we're going to be looking at in 12 months' time. I'll come back and say, oh yeah, we were asked to do this, and we had to take action here. We did deep dives into traders and poultry, and this is a different rationale. These are sectors that came up which are highly concentrated at an international level. So one of the big things about food markets is that they are local and they're global at the same time at different levels. So you have a small-scale farmer. That farmer is buying seeds and fertilizer, and those are global concentrated markets. The farmer is selling locally, but the processing of the product may be going into soya, into animal feed, or vegetable oil. This may also be traded. So this poses particular challenges to authorities, and particularly around cooperation, which we want to bring out. And then we've got the way forward we want to pick up for the ICN to consider, and we'll come back to this, as I said, in the discussion and the breakout sessions. We want to really make this as concrete as possible. How do we deepen the insights that are coming from the country experiences? How do we make the kind of toolkit for price monitoring practical? And so we really want to hear all of your inputs on this. This is the fertilizer price. The orange line is the urea price. You can see it's gone from $400 to $850. It's doubled. This is World Bank global deep sea fertilizer prices. The other price, DAP, not so much yet, but may go up much more quickly. And in South Africa, this is already being anticipated. This is a cartoon from 2 days ago on an open access online publication. This shows the Competition Commission has really cut through. People understand rockets and feathers. Prices are going up like rockets, and they expect them to come down like feathers. And if it comes down like feathers, then profit margins will open up. So this is success in the sense that the people are talking about it. It's also a demand because it's an expectation on the authority to say, are you checking whether this is just cost related? Or is the adjustment process too slow? And therefore you have the scarring. And that will mean interest rates stay higher for longer, etc. Okay, so that's my quick introduction. I hope that's useful. And this tells us what the expectations are in South Africa from the public in terms of the adjustments that we're going to see. So let me turn to the panel now. We've got an excellent panel. Farah Nabiha Mustafa is the head of competition economics. The Malaysian Competition Commission has been intimately involved in the issues there. Natalie Jalabert is an NGA, leader of the Antitrust and Competition Division in the Antitrust Practice Europe for Mayor Brown. And Eduardo Gonzalez Martinez is the commissioner and director at the National Competition Commission of Paraguay. Okay, I'm going to start, first of all, by asking about market monitoring, market and price monitoring and advocacy. I'm going to start with the authorities, first of all, so both Farah and Eduardo. Just to say, so what has been your experience of price monitoring? What did you do and how effective was it? And what do you think the lessons are going forwards? And I'll start with Farah because you're closest to me here.
Thank you, Simon, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this important project and also the topic today. In Malaysia, competition law, we have source of power to actually conduct market review and general study. We have done quite a plenty on agriculture and food, starting with broiler back in 2014, and we also have done on selected food items around cabbage, infant formula, beef, coconut, onion, paddy and rice. And currently we're looking at two varieties of fish, Indian mackerels, and also two leafy vegetables. So when it comes to our market review and also general study, we not only look at on the competition issue, but we also look at market and policy issue. More often than not, three things that's actually interrelated to one another. And the recommendation we put forth is actually not just for us to do something about it, but also for the relevant authorities to act on it as well. In terms of price monitoring, we have existing ministry and also agency that collecting frontline prices. What we do as competition authority, we get those prices and actually do more deep dive on the structures of the market and also finding out what actually the issue in the market. And currently, we are looking at 10-year price study. And we also remove the temporary noises such as COVID pandemic to see what actually the issues and the market, and then we can push for recommendation.
Thanks. So a lot that you're doing across a lot of things. So taking a lot of resources and time, I imagine there. So we'll come back to potentially next steps as well. Eduardo, this is the value of the ICN. In preparing for this panel, I learned that Paraguay has a market observatory. This was something that I'd never realized. So, Eduardo, please tell us about the Paraguay authorities' experiences with the market observatory and how it led into further actions and the different types of actions that may be underway.
Well, thank you, Simon. Thank you very much for the ICN for the invitation. For be part of this distinguished panel with this distinguished colleague. So I will speak about not price monitoring. I will speak about market observatory. As you know, Simon, we want to talk about a very specific angle, the angle of competition authority. Let me start by separating two things that are often confused in public debate. One thing is price monitoring and price control. Public in our countries, when we talk about price monitoring, they think price control. They want to fix prices or put caps in the prices because the food prices are increased in all around the world. And in our country, it's not a difference. And in the Latin region, it's also a problem. So price control is a regulatory tools that fix or caps prices. But the different things is price monitoring as a market intelligence tool for a competition authority. The first one intervene in the market. The second one observe the market to detect failures. In CONACOM, we do the second one. We built a market observatory because we have some market study, but the market study is like a photograph. It's like a static picture. And the market are the dynamics, and we need to transform this photograph in a movie. So that is why CONACOM developed a market observatory, a permanent infrastructure to capture, process, analyze data on prices, volumes, and market share, systematically linked to concentration and structural dominance metrics, because price is not the objective to a competition agency. It's a tool. We need to mix prices monitoring with CR3, CR4, H88 radios, and some econometrics tools to make this market observatory works, to see what happened in the market, because normally competition agency is not too fast to see what happened in the market. We need this kind of tool, and we work to build this tool. We have just a year for this market observatory. It's in our website in CONACOM. But we took but this is important. We took the data and the information for a public service, for a public data, for Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Agriculture, and we took this information, analyze, and make a report of our market observatory.
And just to follow up, I mean, so, we're not price setters. I think we're going to have, unanimity on that. But if you're looking at the observatory, you're looking at the market outcomes. I mean, one thing could be to explain the market outcomes. So authorities have become like experts, explanators of market outcomes, right? But if you do find a competition concern, then people would expect you to act. Did you find, or you could do, if there's a regulatory barrier, you'd advise on the regulatory barrier. Were there any particular competition issues, or was it just about the explanation?
Well, this is an issue because people they need small information. They need not a big report or a very technical report. They need information about what happened in this market, because if we have a 70% of the market by 3 companies, that means concentration. That means a problem with the prices, maybe. But also, we have a problem with the Strait of Hormuz, and the gas is increased in all over the world, but it's not a part of the competition. It's an external problem. So people normally they don't want to know what happened really. They want a solution. So that is important because we have to communicate to people that is not a competition problem. That means be an external problem, a global problem like a war or something. But this is an issue because people, they want to you do something with the prices. And in many parts, it's not a competition issue, it's a regulatory issue.
Thanks. And turning to Natalie, I mean, you know, as a practitioner advising companies, I mean, what's your perspective on this? I mean, it sounds like asking you a kind of obvious question, but still, I think it's really interesting because companies must be coming along and saying, I mean, I know in France you have a lot of observatories, etc. There's a lot of market checks, etc. What's your perspective from advising clients on this?
Indeed, Simon, I'm happy to offer the view of a practitioner assisting companies in competition cases. And in France in particular, where no need to stress that the food industry is absolutely strategic in France. So we've invested over time a lot in looking at prices, monitoring not only prices, but also margins. And that's, we have an observatory that has been looking at the prices in the food industry for many, many years. It's very helpful, not only to detect potential competition issues, but also to ensure that competition issues are examined by the competition authority in the right context, looking at prices over time. Now, when it turns to look at margins, even more than looking at prices, it can start to be pretty controversial, because you can debate at length for hours and days on how to calculate a margin, what should be included and not included. And that's where, in competition cases, companies can have very mixed views on the value of these price and margin monitoring. My takeaways, I'd say I'd have three main comments about price and margin monitoring. First is that obviously food markets do deserve very close monitoring, but it's highly complicated. There are many different approaches. The European Commission released a report, it was back in 2019, precisely on these aspects of methodology. And because we all look at things differently, you mentioned regulation. Regulations are different from one country to another. Methodology to do monitorings are very different. It's all very costly as well. And at the end of the day, it's very difficult to draw comparisons. Very difficult, and it's challenging, and pay attention would be my takeaway. Pay attention to too easy comparisons between one jurisdiction and another, between one period and another. Food prices and food margins may be impacted by many, many different factors, and this deserves absolutely careful consideration. And it's critical to me to get all stakeholders involved in how you do these price monitorings. It's better to involve them early in the process to ensure, acceptance of the figures that come out. That would be my main comments on these aspects, Simon.
Thanks very much. So, I mean, this is something which I guess, in terms of the paper that's looked at experiences, we want to be able to build on. So, if all countries are all being asked similar questions, approaching it in different ways, how can it be made more effective? And the products we're talking about are essentially the same. It's not that the rules are the same, but if you're talking about vegetable oil, or you're talking about staple foods generally, wheat flour, etc., chicken, then we're talking about the same types of products. And so I think there's lots to be gained from comparative experiences. Okay, moving to the second part. So the other thing that the survey of authorities identified was there were really big concerns by many countries in evaluating international mergers and international cartels. That many authorities found that they were not able to obtain the data that they would like to have had to evaluate this. And we're talking about authorities maybe in smaller jurisdictions or in middle income and developing countries. And the markets that they were looking at in these big mergers or cartels were kind of international markets, big multinational companies. Now this of course applies to industries outside of food. This is not a food-specific issue. So it's a real kind of back to basics, but it was particularly pertinent because, you know, food was such a sensitive category of products. So this part of the special project is essentially looking at these challenges, how big they are, and how can we become more effective in terms of cooperation. This came up a lot yesterday as well. But I wanted to reverse the order and say, ask Natalie, first of all, I mean, you're advising companies filing mergers. What kind of gaps do you see in the efficiency in which, you know, authorities are processing it in these international cases where there's multiple jurisdictions?
We've seen a number of global mergers in the past few months and years, but it strikes me how the approach in the various jurisdictions still remain very different. Because if we have on many food markets global players these days, local competition remains very different from one jurisdiction to another. So you can see a transaction being cleared very rapidly in one jurisdiction and on the contrary, taking a lot of time in others and requiring remedies on the one hand and not on the other hand. So local competition is still very much looked at, which is important. Consumers are local and they don't have the same choice depending on jurisdictions. What strikes me reading at competition decisions, competition authorities' decisions in that sector is how different their decisions are and how focused they are on their local markets. Makes sense, you know, that's what they have jurisdiction on, and but the context is very different from one region or one jurisdiction to another. And sometimes you miss the big picture looking at these fragmented decisions. So that's where I think international cooperation is key between authorities to understand how production in one jurisdiction may impact the market of others. So certainly the special project for that will bring a lot of benefits. The other striking feature to me is how important we still have debates about market delineation issues in this sector in particular. Competition authorities have been studying these markets for decades, but we still debate for a very long time market delineation, because depending on whether you look at milk or yogurt, it can be different. Depending on whether you're looking at France or the Netherlands, it will also be different. So there also, international cooperation can help. We all have very different regulatory environments and economic environments, but still looking at the decisions across jurisdictions is very important. And then maybe one recent trend also is how consumer welfare is looked at by competition authorities, especially in that sector. Very recently, the European Commission released its, well, not released, it's not public yet, but the Mars-Kellanova merger press release is illustrative of how now competition authorities look at these mergers not only in terms of competition in the first sense, but global consumer welfare. That's definitely a trend we're looking at. And we know that these mergers will take more time because of that reason as well.
Thanks. I mean, I want to turn now to the kind of coal face, as it were, because the decision last year's ICN was to try and deepen our understanding of these challenges by looking at particular sectors. One was commodity traders, where there's 5 companies that are reported to control over 75% of global commodity trade. And the other was poultry, where at the top level, in terms of breeding stock, there are 2 companies that control 90% of the world's breeding stock. We're all eating the same chickens, basically, right? and try and understand how authorities have been able to grapple with these questions. So I'm going to start with Eduardo here, because it's not poultry, but it's beef, I think, where you've had particular issues. It's meat processing, and some of the companies operate across. And of course, the animal feed is one of the key constituents, which is linked back to the commodity traders. So can you tell us about the concerns that you've had in Paraguay and how you've tried to address the fact that they are both local and international at the same time, as a national competition authority, as almost all authorities are, bar a few regional bodies?
Well, Simon, I think this is a poultry or beef or meat problems. It's a phenomenon that every competition authority in our LATAM region or many around the world has on the table, but that is not discussed as much as it should be. Cross-border concentration in food and agriculture value chains are a problem. Beef and grains are two clearest cases in Paraguay and in the southern corn in South America. Well, this is that should do different versions of the same problem: concentration and cross-border concentration. Let me start with the beef industry in Paraguay. Paraguay, in the context, is a small country in the middle of South America. We have only 6 or 7 million of population, but we have more than 40 million of cows in the country. 2 cows per person. So, but maybe 85 to 90% of this beef production is for export. But Paraguayan people eat beef every day. It's part of our dietary. I know that is not healthy, but it's part of our dietary, like Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil. So we have a problem of the meat packers operating in Paraguay, and the largest meat packers are foreign companies. And there are not isolated foreign companies. They are companies, the same companies operate in Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Bolivia, and Colombia. Some names: GBS, Minerva Foods, Athena Foods. That is public information. Marfrig, Frigorífico Concepción, and others. We are talking about companies with plants in 5, 6, or 7 countries in the region. And for example, Minerva, the largest company in the region, operates around 38 meat packing plants across Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, etc. In Paraguay, specifically, after the 2017 operation between GBS and Minerva, Minerva represents more than 50% of the cattle slaughter in Paraguay. What is the problem for a competition policy? Well, our point of view is that 3 concrete effects. First, a merger that is approved or rejected in Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, or another country directly affects the competitive structure in Paraguay. Often without a CONACOM having any formal role in this process. For example, in 2020, 2021, Paraguay rejects CONACOM. In Paraguay rejects an concentration operation within 2 largest meat packing in Paraguay. And 2024, Uruguay competition agency made the same. The others, in the other part of the region, the other countries, they don't do that because in his market maybe not a problem, but it's a problem in the region. It's a problem for small countries like Paraguay or Uruguay, but we are in the same relevant market. The relevant market is not national, it's regional in this case. Well, we made also a national study, study market in our market observatory about the beef industry in Paraguay. And well, we have some data. 3 meat packing plants, they have 70% of national cattle slaughtering, 70% of the market share. This means an oligopoly in the supply side of beef, and at the same time in a oligopoly on the demand side for the cattle farmers. HHI was more than 2,700 points in August 25. It's a highly concentrated market, and with this study, we are now in a formal investigation for collusion for 7 meat packing in Paraguay. So right now, it's a file, it's a formal investigation, and well, this is we are the first agency in the region made a formal investigation for collusion for this meat packing in this industry.
Thanks, brother. I mean, lots of follow-up questions that I'd like to ask, but I'm going to move on to, I'm going to resist the temptation and move on to Farah to ask about the experience I know that you've had specifically with poultry feed and the cross-border dimensions. Meanwhile, you have national jurisdiction, of course. Yeah, can you explain that, the challenges there?
Back in 23, we issued an infringement decisions against 5 poultry feed millers in Malaysia. So 4 out of 5 actually integrator, and 2 out of 4 actually part of a massive global conglomerates, and while the other 2 local companies are also similarly large in Southeast Asia market. Of course, at that time during the investigation, the focus was on Malaysia market, but we also have information where they source the soybean and maize that make up about 72% of the cost to produce a chicken. And those 2 commodities come either from Brazil or from Argentina. And in retrospective, whatever happening in Malaysia market potentially have impact to our counterparts that purchase chicken from us. So that would be something that should be looked more into in future. When it comes to beef, actually we studied twice on beef, 2019 and also 2024. And in one of the evidence for chicken feed cartel, in one of the personal notes is available on our website, there was discussion on chicken feed, and there's also a note saying that on animal feed, free to decide. So they actually also produce animal feed, but they decide not to do a collusion on animal feed, but focus on chicken cartel at that time. So I thought that was interesting that it was mentioned. But yeah, our beef was actually also come from your side of the region. So whatever happening in your side also have potentially impact on Malaysia market actually.
Thanks very much. Yeah.
Maybe, Simon, if I may,
Quick
just
point,
one
yeah.
quick comment. Listening to Eduardo and Farah talking about markets, I've sometimes also assisted companies in defending against cartel allegations, especially in the meat packing. We've seen cases in the animal feed, also in Europe, is that there is a tension for companies active on competitive markets because they have, on the agriculture level, in many jurisdictions, there are exemptions from competition rules at the agriculture level, and companies just at the level below are to apply competition rules completely. And there's a tension here because they are not allowed to do what their counterparts are doing. I have no magical solution there because we understand that agriculture needs to gather and to in many jurisdictions to gain strength by uniting forces together and selling through common channels, but more competition at the agriculture level can only help downstream markets to also behave better, I think.
Thanks. I mean, I see this as, kind of a core challenge to the ICN, because we're finding that there are cross-border issues, regulatory restrictions, etc., arrangements by cartels to regulate markets, and authorities are picking these things up, but they are obviously affecting a much wider range. I mean, if there is arrangements in Paraguay, then it's also going to be affecting the customers. So those may be in Europe, etc. On the input side, as you said, Farah, that if you're doing these arrangements in Malaysia, why would you be doing it only in Malaysia? Well, we know there's a Singapore poultry cartel, which they found, and all the producers in the Singapore poultry cartel are producing their chickens in Malaysia. Right? And Korea has 5 poultry cases on breeding stock, poultry production, and animal feed. The feed one was information exchange, etc. So we can see these things happening, and I think that it's only when we're starting to look, we're seeing how big the challenges for cooperation are. And Eleanor Fox, I just want to shout out, she's worked a lot on the traders' issues and saying authorities are looking at their own areas, and there really are big gaps in this kind of international or enforcement at an international level, because it's obviously by national jurisdictions, apart from the EU, COMESA, and some of the regional blocs. Okay, we have only 9 minutes left, so I'm not sure they've stolen back some of the time from us. But I did want to go out and ask for short contributions and comments, particularly in terms of also the resonance of these issues and potentially the way forward. And I said this will be picked up in the breakout session. So I know there's lots of very other interesting competing breakout sessions, but the food one's going to be really exciting. So a couple of points, questions from people on the floor. I know I'm going to call out Lucas, because Austria was really involved in terms of the food project at the beginning. So I'm going to ask him to say a couple of things. And we had a lot of support from different authorities on this. And I'm going to make it really fast. I'm going to do, can you bring a microphone? Yeah, great. And is there a second or a third hand? Then we'll do quick ones, and then we'll do a wrap-up set of comments. Anybody else want to comment? And over here, that's great. Okay, thanks.
All right, thank you. I want to briefly share with you the Austrian experience in that respect. We actually concluded quite a comprehensive sector inquiry some time ago. It was basically against the backdrop of quite significant price increases, supply chain disruptions, and rising inflation. Against this background, it's a matter of concern for us. And I want to briefly share with you also the key findings. I mean, the retail food sector is quite concentrated in Austria. So we have approximately more than 90% of market shares with the 4 largest retailers. And what was also an interesting observation was actually that especially international corporations apply different price strategies, and they also try to prevent cross-border trade. Equally important that a significant number of suppliers reported that they experienced unfair trading practices. So maybe also coming to the lessons learned, methodology matters, especially if you send RFIs to a lot of stakeholders in the market. And I think also a fair point is, what is the objective of a market inquiry? And in our case, it particularly showed that what are the competition conditions, and it also helped us to objectify the public debate in that respect. Yeah, as I've said, I think it clearly also showed that there is a necessity for international cooperation, because there is apparently a cross-border element in some of these aspects. And last but certainly not least, what also showed to us was that UTP enforcement is complementary, and this instrument is quite critical in our view to address supplier and retail imbalances. Thank you.
And then I'll just come back to the panel after this for a quick final comments and suggestions on the way forward.
Thank you, Simon. It's an excellent panel, a lot of good information coming from there. And It's interesting to know that most of the issues that have been discussed there are very common, thousands of kilometers away from your countries. So it shows how we are grappling with similar issues. But I just want to put it on record to thank Shamba, CRAID, the African Market Observatory, and now the advisory center that we are talking about, especially for African markets. And I think it's a very important tool that would and should be helping competition authorities, because the biggest challenge we have, as rightly put by Simon and Natalie, is data. We would want to intervene in these markets sometimes, but you can't intervene when you don't have data. You can't intervene based on speculation. And I think this is one good job CRAID, Shamba, and the AMO, and I think the Advisory Center should be doing. I can give an example in our case on some of the things that we have done in the past. I remember the SABIC AN merger, which Shamba, and I think assisted us in terms of the post-merger review. And there were a number of concerns that arose, not that the decision was wrong, but maybe we could have had similar decisions, a bit more remedies in that case, if we had good data. And I think that was observed by that ex-post major review. What that did, and I think I'm just commending the work of these institutions, what that did was to identify the gaps, develop tools on how, in fact, we can obtain that information, which tools, in fact, were codified in the new amended law. For example, one of the things that were identified was that the data that we are asking merging parties to provide us, the historical data, was not sufficient for us to understand the trends in the market over a good period of time. We would ask for pricing data, for example, market shares and the like, for a period of 2 years. And I think in that ex-post major review, we were guided that this would be very difficult to show you the accurate picture of the evolution of such markets. And I think a longer period was recommended. But finally, Simon, the question from me to you is, how do we intend to concretize and have an impactful the results of all these market observatories, the data that is coming out, the reports that are coming out, how do we ensure that it goes just beyond competition authorities? Because we can have those good reports, put them in our offices, and it remains there, and I think that is commonly what I've observed. Thank you.
Thanks. And I think this is the challenge to take away, which is how do we, you can see there's a potential for a knowledge base. We aspire to develop a knowledge base, but we have not been able to do it. So the ICN is a network, but we are not generating the synergies from the network. We keep on finding more experiences. And the question, I think, to everybody is how do we set up a structure or a system to improve this? I'm going to go to the panel who's not going to be able to answer this, but it's what would be top of your mind in terms of next steps and any final comments in the last couple of minutes that we've got? Our clock is ticking down here in front of us. I'll just go along in order here.
My ambition is to make food sexier than digital economy, so that's one. So second, I think we all collectively need to improve our cross-border intelligence. So that is actually very important, the information sharing as when we are doing things, not the aftermath.
On the side of companies, you all know that there are many questions around sustainability initiatives and the point to which competition authorities can sustain these sustainability initiatives in industry sectors. Sometimes these sustainability initiatives go across borders. I have in mind a case from the Bundeskartellamt concerning bananas and a sustainability initiative from German retailers to increase the wages of Ecuador, I think, farmers. That was very useful to a number of industry players in other countries, and I think the ICN could very usefully look at those sustainability initiatives and how they have been supported across the world by all your competition authorities and prepare reports and guidance. That would be very helpful for all.
Thanks, Eduardo.
Okay, totally agree with the data is an issue. And so we need a regional database because more of the data is public, but is hard to find because are in a minister level or something, are public data in each countries, but we don't have access to this data, the public data, not confidential. So I think the international cooperation is the way. Even today exists this international cooperation, but it's uneven and largely informal. We need 3 concrete steps, I think. Real-time information exchange protocols, appropriate confidentiality, of course, coordinate economic analysis on regional cases, capacity building, support for smaller authorities like us. We thought that the third element, asymmetries within authorities will keep widening, and that hurt the system as a whole. So I think the international cooperation made a regional database. That is the next step for MERA, a regional cooperation to cross-border problems.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the panel and the contributions that came from the floor. I mean, this issue is not going to go away. I mean, that's what's very, very clear about it. It's bread and butter, or fish and rice, depending on where your country is in terms of the staple foods. And we have a global market for fertilizer, but equally there's a global market for animal feed, for soybeans. I mean, if your rice production here is going to depend on fertilizer, your poultry production, fish farming is also going to depend on animal feed and soya. The same is true in southern Africa or East Africa, where we've done a lot of work. The Shamba Center that Dr. Mwembo from Commerce is referring to is Karen Smaller is an NGA here for Kenya, and she'll be talking about the work that they've been doing, and we've been working with them. So if you're interested in that, and this is about cooperation within East and Southern Africa. So I'm hoping that we come forward with next steps, and it's a lot has been done in terms of this communication. The Malaysian decision, I would urge people to read this. It's a fantastic decision, explains all the dimensions. It's relevant, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about the case in Paraguay, and we're certainly going to look at the Market Observatory and how you address these questions. And I think this is what the ICN is so useful for. So a big round of applause, I think, for all the panelists, and thank you all very much.
Thank you very much to our moderator, Mr. Simon Roberts. May I request for the moderator as well as all of our speakers to please take center stage. Please remain on stage, center stage for a photo op. And it's a wrap for the first session for today, our special project plenary promoting competition in food and agriculture markets. We had Mr. Simon Roberts as our moderator, along with our distinguished speakers, Ms. Farha Nabiha of the Malaysia Competition Commission, Ms. Nathalie Jalabert of France, and Mr. Eduardo Gonzalez of the National Competition Commission of Paraguay. What a wonderful discussion that was, but we are not going to keep you waiting any longer. We are going to proceed right next to the very next one. Thank you once again to our moderator and speakers for that insightful discussion on competition in food and agriculture markets. May I request for another warm round of applause for them, please? As we continue, we now move to the Unilateral Conduct Working Group Plenary, entitled Striking the Balance Between Effectiveness, predictability, apologies, and accuracy in the enforcement of unilateral conduct rules. This session focuses on a key challenge in enforcement, how to strike the right balance between effectiveness, predictability, and accuracy in addressing unilateral conduct. While clear rules and structured approaches help ensure consistency and deterrence, enforcement must also remain flexible enough to respond to evolving markets and increasingly complex forms of behavior. To guide this discussion, we are joined by our moderator, Ms. Gina Cass Gottlieb of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. A round of applause for her, please. She is joined by our distinguished speakers, Ms. Elisabetta Jossa of the Italian Competition Authority. A warm welcome for her, please. We also have Mr. Guillaume Loriot, Directorate General for Competition, European Commission, European Union. Along with Ms. Michal Cohen of the Israel Competition Authority, Ms. Liat Ariela Davis of the National Competition Commission of Paraguay. And finally, Mr. Andy Chi Min Chen of the Fair Trade Commission, Taiwan. I believe everyone is already here. Let's get started with this, shall we? Ms. Gottlieb, all yours.
Good morning, colleagues. It's great to be with you. This is going to be a very interesting panel. Balance is always such an elusive concept, and in this case, we've got the right people to talk about it. It's a very genuinely diverse set of enforcement experiences that we have. On my left, we have Professor Elisabetta Jossa, who is Acting President of the Italian Competition Authority, full Professor of Economics at the University of Rome. Then we have Guillaume Loriot. Guillaume is the Deputy Director General for Mergers at DG Comp. Guillaume has also served as Director in charge of Telecom, Media and Technology Competition Cases and Deputy Head of Cabinet for former Vice President Joaquin Almunia, former European Commissioner for Competition Policy. Next, we have Michal Cohen, who is the Director General of the Israel Competition Authority. Michal has also previously held multiple legal roles at the authority, including as legal advisor for criminal and civil affairs. We are also joined by Dr. Liat Ariela Davis. One moment. Who is visiting research scholar at the Competition Law Center at George Washington University. Liat's academic research focuses on competition law adjudication, examining how legal systems reconcile multiple objectives, particularly in South Africa. And we're pleased to be joined by Dr. Andy Chen, Vice Chairperson and Acting Chairperson of the Taiwan Fair Trade Commission. Many of us know Andy well. He leads the Commission's work at the OECD and ICN and was previously a Professor of Law at Chung Yuan Christian University. We are going to start by inviting each panellist to give some opening remarks on unilateral conduct rules, please, in your jurisdiction, and where you see the balance that we are seeking to identify here. And I will start with Andy.
Thank you, Gina. And I would also like to thank the ICN and the PCC for inviting me to this panel to share our enforcement experience. In Taiwan, we have some built-in mechanism in our law and principle guidelines to ensure a proper balance between predictability and flexibility could be stricken. So for example, Article 8 of our Fair Trade Act provides 50% market share threshold as well as specific amounts of business turnover threshold below which a business will be presumed to be lack of monopoly power. And in the area of vertical restraint, resale price maintenance has traditionally been reviewed under the rule of presumed illegality. And non-price restraint, we have 50% market share threshold to initiate our investigation. And beyond those structural threshold, we sometimes, occasionally, we rely on conduct-based threshold, such as the Lerner's index or the cross-sector or cross-market profit comparison to infer market dominance in real cases. But I think the whole enforcement framework remains inherently flexible. So for example, in the same article, Article 8, it allows the TFTC to intervene when we experience a very high entry barrier in the market that we reviewed. So even if a business is under the threshold, we could still characterize it as a monopolist. And we recently has just incorporated market share consideration into the RPM case. I think that will allow the TFTC to exclude RPM cases with trivial market share and negligible market impacts. And with regard to the 50% market share for initiating non-price restraint, again, the law also allows the TFTC to intervene if there is the evidence indicating unfair or unbalanced unbalanced position between contractual parties. So I think this is the basic framework in our law to ensure the predictability and the flexibility. And this balance has recently been challenged by the cases related to digital markets. So that's the reason, in response to this kind of challenge, the TFTC released a white paper on competition policy in digital economy in 2022, as well as more recently, we issue a policy statement for generative AI in 2026. In both documents, we adopt a flexible enforcement approach. I think the policy choice reflects our concern over the highly dynamic and sometimes unpredictable development in the digital market. And so by doing that, we aim to ensure that the selection of enforcement rule could be better accommodate the technological development in the long run. Thank you, Gina.
Thanks very much, Andy. Michal, interested to hear your experiences of the challenges.
Thank you, Gina, and thanks the ICN for inviting me to this panel. I will start with that in Israel, over the last 15 years, we've seen a real pendulum swing between regulatory certainty on the one hand, to enforcement flexibility on the other. Like 15 years ago, our system was all about certainty. Today, we prioritize the power to stop harmful conduct and to boost deterrence. And the focus has shifted toward flexibility, and you can see it everywhere in the legislation, in the court ruling, and the competition authority policy. So for a long time, the Israeli economic competition law didn't have really right tools to tackle exclusionary conduct by dominant players. Our main weapon back then was criminal enforcement. And while criminal charges are highly effective against cartels, they are terrible fit for unilateral conduct, and the nature of the criminal process and the beyond reasonable doubt standard just doesn't fit to complex economic analysis and expert testimonies. So we really didn't enforce at all unilateral conduct, and the bottom line, we couldn't do anything, so the pendulum started shifting toward the other side in 2012, when the Director General was finally given the power to impose administrative financial sanctions on both companies and individuals. And even then, the law was written with extreme caution. It was heavily tilted toward predictability. During the legislative process, corporation argued that authorities being given too much power to run wild, and they claimed they have no way to predict what was legal or how to protect themselves from unpredictable enforcement. And to address those concerns, the Israeli parliament built several safety nets into the 2012 reforms. First, even well before 2012, monopoly was strictly defined as holding a market share of over 50%. That means that a firm with 45% of a market was effectively immune from abuse of dominance enforcement, even if it exercised significant market power. And the legislator went a step further and ruled that a fine could only be imposed if the conduct was on a specific list published by the Director General. And another caution step that was taken by the legislator was limitation of the maximum fine. While the authority asked for a cap of 10% over the total turnover, the law passed with a much lower cap of 8% and not exceeding 24 million shekels, which is $8 million. So the goal of all this limitation was to ensure predictability and to avoid chilling effect on innovation. And interestingly, but actually not surprisingly, even with all these safeguards, the business community still complained that monetary sanctions would freeze pro-competitive behavior. So in the years since, the pendulum has shifted, and in my view, for the better, toward much more effective enforcement, but I will elaborate on this later.
Thanks very much, Michal. Goyam, interested in your experience and the Commission's reflections.
So, well, if you zoom out, obviously effectiveness, accuracy, predictability, I mean, there are key goals of competition enforcement in policy, whatever the area. But obviously there are specific challenges as far as abusive dominance 102 is concerned. And obviously that is one of the challenges we are facing at the moment when, trying to address and update our policy on 102, I mean, on abuse of dominance, where we are trying to, we are about to adopt guidelines on abuses of dominance for the first time. There's some guidance on priorities, but that would be really the first time that there's proper guidance on 102. So how does that translate in practice? How do you deal with effectiveness? How do you deal with accuracy? How do you deal with predictability when you want to be comprehensive in dealing with abuses of dominance? That is an area, obviously, that is a complex area. So I think when you consider effectiveness in terms of enforcing Article 102, so EU law, with regard to abuses of dominance, I think there are several aspects. One is, how do you make sure that you work with workable standards so that your enforcement is effective and essentially doesn't make your enforcement practically impossible? Because it's nice to be theoretical, to be deep, but you also need to be practical, to be relevant, to be timely in your enforcement. And obviously that's a challenge that we've all been facing, me personally and others, when dealing with big potential abuse cases. And that is something that has been a big lesson inside DigiComp on how we should steer that policy with regard to 102. That also means, in my view, that some types of unilateral conduct can generally be recognized as harming competition without having to go through a full-fledged, assessment of its effects. You can still have an effects-based assessment, but, apprehend certain forms of conduct as potentially abusive without going into all the ins and outs of the impact of the behavior. And I think that is something that is emerging from the case law, at least in Europe at the moment, which is, I think, reassuring. Obviously, there are distinctions to be made, but I think that is something that, competition authorities should be more and more comfortable with. Now, as far as effectiveness is concerned, that also means, being able to act quickly, to be relevant. And I'm sure Elisabetta will talk about that, but interim measures are one example. Personally, I dealt with one of these cases when I was still in my previous position, with the Broadcom case, where we brought interim measures against that company in an exclusive dealing case. That was the first time for, 20 years that the Commission hadn't been adopting interim measures. That was a kind of event inside the House, but, from some national competition authorities, that they have a test that was maybe easier to meet. Ours was pretty difficult, but we thought we have to do it, because otherwise, you can have a nice decision in 4 years, but the harm is done. So these are, I think, 3 concrete dimensions of, what it means being effective, in particular with regard to abuse of dominance cases. When it comes to accuracy, obviously that should be the ultimate goal of any competition authority, whatever infringement you're talking about, whatever conduct you're talking about. And the question is obviously having an effects-based assessment. I think we're all there, that is accurate, but there are variations. And sometimes there's a discussion about presumptions. Should some behavior be presumed to be abusive? And I think that's the sense of the case law. But what you need is that those presumptions are based on solid economic evidence, not formalistic presumptions, something that is really based on empirical evidence, on experience, so that you can work on that basis and be effective. It doesn't mean that this presumption is not rebuttable. Obviously, it should be rebuttable. There should be the capacity for companies to show why it wouldn't be justified in that particular case. But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't work with presumptions when justified for certain types of conduct. I think that is a work stream, obviously, that we have in mind. And last but not least, when it comes to predictability, and that's a difficult one. That's really, there's a paradox there. And I'm saying it from case practice and experience, is that on the one hand, you need to be flexible. You need to be able to address new behaviors for which there's no precedent. I remember very well, dealing with the Google shopping case, self-referencing, we never used that term in the decision, by the way, dealing with Android, raising new issues, anti-fragmentations and so on, that were unknown by definition, because we were, talking about behaviors that didn't happen in the offline world, potentially, and we had to deal with them, take some risks, set precedents, no case law, going to court and trying to win it. And you need that flexibility to be able to, to be agile, to be relevant, to address new issues, not always doing the same cases with the same behaviors. So I think that is very important, but at the same time, it shouldn't be done at the expense of some degree of predictability. And that's where guidelines, come in. That's why it's important to be able to update your code book, to be able to systematize what you've been doing, so as to give first your case handlers, your staff, guidance on how to deal with cases, but also the market, that the market can be able to predict with some reasonable degree of certainty what, you can be expected not to do, at least to be investigated, while on the other hand being able to do other things that would be compatible with a competitive market and competition on the market So I think predictability matters, and guidelines are there to set principles, and that is very important, because I think the common point of any competition agency should be to be based, to have a facts-based approach, evidence-based approach, being accurate. But on the other hand, being principled. The rule of law is the absolute rule, and you should aim for that, while preserving that flexibility in all respects. So I think 102 is really the example of the area with all these goals, interacting in very complex ways, but that shouldn't prevent us from trying to address that through guidelines.
Thanks very much, Guillaume. Liat, so we have a lot of complexity and important objectives. Interested to know the insights. I think you'll find that, switch it on, I hope so, the insights that you bring from your research.
Thank you, Gina, and thank you so much to the ICN for having me, and a particular Thank you to the Paraguayan authority, CONACOM, for giving me the honor of being their NGA. I'm not a regulator. I don't work for an enforcer. I'm an aspiring academic, and so I'm going to give a more overarching perspective on this issue. So when we discuss unilateral conduct enforcement, and particularly, I would say, abuse of dominance, I think it's important to recognize just how context dependent this area of competition law is. Market structures differ radically across sectors, certainly across jurisdictions. The forms of dominance exercised within those markets differ radically, and the competitive effects of particular conduct are often highly dependent on the surrounding economic and institutional context. As a result, unilateral conduct enforcement is structurally resistant to rigid legal specification in a way that competition law discussions do not always fully acknowledge. There's often an assumption that predictability is primarily a matter of improving guidance, refining legal tests, or clarifying enforcement priorities. And of course, don't get me wrong, those things matter. But I think the difficulty runs much deeper than that. The sheer variety of circumstances in which unilateral conduct rules are applied makes it extraordinarily difficult to generate rules of dense particularity. Modern effects-based analysis intensifies this difficulty further. So once competition law moves away from relatively formalistic approaches and toward economically contextual reasoning, authorities and courts are increasingly required to make evaluative judgments about market structure, foreclosure effects, consumer harm, innovation incentives, and obviously longer-term competitive dynamics. Now, to be clear, I do not mean that unilateral conduct enforcement is simply an open-ended policy exercise. Much of abuse of dominance law operates through relatively structured doctrinal categories, whether it's predatory pricing, refusals to deal, tying, and so forth. But even within these categories, modern analysis remains highly contextual and economically contingent. And the complexity increases further where competition regimes pursue multiple objectives alongside traditional competition concerns, whether it's fairness, labor protection, environmental sustainability, innovation, economic inclusion, and broader public interest considerations. Now, one may welcome that development, and I largely do, but we should also recognize what follows from it institutionally. The more competition law embraces context-sensitive and economically responsive forms of analysis, the harder it becomes to maintain rigid forms of predictability. And that, to my mind, is the real trade-off confronting modern competition systems. There's no slot machine version of unilateral conduct analysis where one inserts facts and automatically obtains an answer. So for me, the central challenge is not whether we should choose between certainty or predictability. Predictability plainly matters. It matters for legality, for fairness, for business planning, and the credibility of enforcement itself. But where unilateral conduct analysis is inherently contextual and where multiple objectives may legitimately become relevant, predictability cannot solely come solely from ever more detailed rules or guidance. So the deeper challenge, and I think the real institutional necessity, is where the competition law systems can develop sufficiently coherent normative frameworks capable of structuring, guiding, and justifying discretionary judgments in principled ways. Because in my mind, without such frameworks, the danger is not merely uncertainty. The danger is actually incoherence. Outcomes that appear ad hoc because there's no sufficiently clear account of why one set of considerations prevailed over another. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Liat. Elisabetta, we have complexity, the need for coherence. I'm interested in your thoughts.
Thank you, Gina. It's a pleasure to be here in this panel. Thanks to the Philippine Authority for the wonderful hosting. Let me get back perhaps to some of the concepts that have already been shared, and in particular, get back to these three magic words, predictability, effectiveness, and accuracy, which are the three ingredients we all perceive we need to have in order to have effective enforcement. Somehow in the debate, there is a perception sometimes that there may be trade-offs between predictability, effectiveness, and accuracy, as if in order to be predictable, you need to set, per se rules with little flexibility, but that might reduce your effectiveness and sometimes also accuracy. In fact, I think in Europe we have this principle-based approach which shows that predictability, effectiveness, and accuracy can go hand in hand. And it can go hand in hand if you use the analytical framework which we have, and that is the basis for the principle-based framework that we use in order to assess how competition works in the market, what the incentives of firms are, what are their capabilities, what are the potential effects of a conduct. And I think this analytical framework, which is based on solid economic theory, allows us to aim to be both predictable and effective and accurate if you apply that analytical framework in a technical way, making technical decisions. So in this regard, I think in Europe, the independence of antitrust authorities allows us to be and remain technical, and this allows predictability, again, effectiveness and accuracy. And I also think that it warrants against opening up to other policy objectives or government objectives that may move us away from the technical assessment, because it's really remaining technical, which ensures that firms have the possibility to predict how we will consider their conduct and whether we will pursue an investigation or not, which is then necessary for firms to make their long-term investment and incentives. So I think this European framework, principle-based, plus the possibilities to remain technical is really effective and allows also to ensure predictability.
Thanks very much, Elisabetta. We're now going to have a few questions with the panel. We will be also coming to the floor. I believe that we will have Slido available for that. If not, and there will be a QR code put up so that you can start to put all your questions in. There we are. So do, if anything prompts you as you listen to the panelists, please do start logging your questions. So what we're going to look to here, we've had this discussion looking at what the risks are on the one side of being too predictable, in fact, and too rigid, and in fact thereby risking the situation that there is insufficient discretion and the breadth for effects-based analysis to actually take account of what are differences in rapidly changing markets that we are all seeing. Andy, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on what these risks are on both sides that we're looking at here. And in addition, have you experienced indicators where the elements are off balance and impeding your ability to achieve your objectives?
Thank you, Gina, for the question. I think in essence, the risks inherent in choosing between an overly rigid rules and the overly flexible standard or criteria may be understood from the perspective of the error cost the enforcement might create from these two selections. And I think both the false positive or false negatives may lead to very suboptimal competition and innovation. And from a policy perspective, I think the error cost issue could be examined from the two preliminary dimensions. I think the first dimension concerned about which error cost is more likely to occur within a specific market scenario. And from a very high conceptual level, I think a pure flexible approach characterized by the multi-factor consideration or the rule of reason type of analysis, it implies that the overall enforcement might lead to the balanced false positive and false negatives. In contrast, a pure positive prescriptive rule in which the liability will be presumed when the thresholds are crossed will probably tilt the scale toward false positive. And on the other hand, when we adopted a more flexible enforcement approach, I think the false negative cost might be more likely to arise. But I know it's difficult to have a very definitive response to this type of discussion. But nevertheless, I still think asking the question may remind the enforcement agency to be mindful of the market characteristics, and especially the accumulated enforcement experience over the market under review. I think these are two very decisive determinants to evaluate the frequency or the severity of the error cost. And I think that the second dimension we might ask, when errors do occur, are there mechanisms in place to effectively detect and to mitigate the market impacts? I think this is a very foundational question for all competition agencies. And I think also it explains why most of the jurisdictions adopt a kind of a mixed approach, mixed framework that are combining both rigid and prescriptive rule, and at the same time flexible criteria. And here I just want to point out one frequently overlooked mechanism in addition to the more formal policy and legal design to address the error cost. And that is the self-correction function provided by market. I know it sounds a little bit unrealistic and probably naive for some of you to think a self-correction function market is it likely to be any good for the enforcement, especially in the digital market? We're talking about the market tipping. So this kind of wait and see approach might be unrealistic. But however, we continue to observe in practice the dynamic competition in action. The dominant firm are regularly and sometimes unpredictably replaced by new rival offering superior ecosystems. So this constant competition pressure sort of reminds us or implies that self-correction function by the market may be a complement to the formal intervention. And I think this is especially so in market where competition agencies may not have or only have limited enforcement experience. And finally, I just want to point out a concern. When we before we release the AI policy statement, we conduct a public survey in Taiwan. And we have received responses indicating that they were concerned about the capital advantage and the profit margin enjoyed by those big tech firms. And some of them suggest that these two elements might be treated as the threshold to inferring market dominance. And I think we should be cautious about that by relying exclusively on profit margin or the capital advantage to infer market dominance without considering at the same time market contestability. Because I think the difficulty lies in the fact capital is an input, not a direct measure for competitive outcome. And profit margin might sometimes reflect the market efficiency or the economy of scale or brand value. I think both criteria will fluctuate with the consumers' preferences or the business cycle. So if we apply statically those criteria to infer market dominance, we might mischaracterize market competition as abuse of dominance. So that's the point I just made at this moment. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Michael, you've given us a clear picture of the way in which the jurisdiction swung on a pendulum between highly prescriptive and, in fact, business lobbying to continue to be highly prescriptive and a search for greater flexibility. What have you seen the risks and benefits that have transpired?
Thank you, Gina. So as I mentioned earlier, before 2012, the Israeli legal framework was way too prescriptive. This essentially crippled our ability to enforce the law, to create real deterrence, and we were completely off balance. So unless you have a company with a 50% plus market share and smoking gun, evident of intent to harm competition, enforcement was not existent. So there were few attempts to go over certain behaviors, but they usually ended in unimpressive consent decrees because commissioners didn't have the right tool to threaten lawbreakers with. And even after 2012 reforms, we stayed overly cautious in favor of business predictability. The $8 million cap on fine was a major issue. For big corporation, that's not a deterrent, it's just the cost of doing business. So businesses got exactly what they wanted, clarity and predictability. They could calculate the risks, but in my view, competition was left unprotected. And more than that, requiring the authority to prove specific relevant market and 50% plus share created an undue burden, and it meant that we actually couldn't touch anti-competitive actions taken by firms that had massive market power but fell just below 50% line. So we were still off balance, and the clearance sign that we were off balance was the number of unilateral conduct cases the authority prosecuted during this period. Like between 2012 to 2019, we had only 4 unilateral conduct cases, and that just didn't reflect the reality on ground. Israel is an island economy. Because of our geography and geopolitics, we don't have natural cross-border competition you see in other places. And our core sectors like food, retail, banking, energy are highly concentrated. And in an environment like ours, a dominant firm can entrench itself easily, and once market tips, it stays tipped. So this wasn't still the core problem, but with regard to the discussion here today, we simply don't have the luxury of getting this balance wrong. And even though, regrettably, that was the case for many, many years. And we realized we had to swing the pendulum back towards enforcement flexibility. So to fix this, we passed Amendment 21 in 2019. And in fact, during the legislative process, we truly felt that Parliament was with us. I believe that the rising cost of living in Israel, which everyone across all sectors has felt deeply in recent years, led the Parliament to change its its approach to stop focusing on businesses and start thinking about consumers. So first, the law amendment in 2019 introduced significant market power standard. So today a company is considered a monopoly according to the Israeli law if it holds significant market power regardless of its numerical market share. And this gave us the flexibility to target harmful conduct by dominant firms that might not hit the 50% plus mark in rigidly defined market, but still control the game. We also gave the law more teeth. The maximum fine was raised to approximately $33 million, or now it's even more, around 40, I think. And these changes allow the authority to increase both quantity and intensity of enforcement and to create much more effective deterrence than before. So, of course, this flexibility came at a cost. Businesses started asking, how do we know we have significant market power? Our volume discounts or loyalty rebates still legal? And I will touch on this later on, but I can conclude with this. When we weigh the risks of false positive against false negative, I am far more worried about the false negative, the type 2 errors. With rising cost of living in Israel, we need uncompromising enforcement. We cannot allow dominant incumbent to use sophisticated tactics to entrench their monopolies just because their specific behavior wasn't on the explicitly prohibited list. And I think that in our economy, failing to act is much bigger risk than acting too broadly.
Thanks very much, Michal. Liat, we actually, though it's not up on the screen in front of us, I've been receiving quite a few questions, and I have one for you. So I'm going to integrate the questions from the audience into as we run through. So this is from Willard from Comesa. He says, Liat, thank you for the wonderful perspective from academia. You're absolutely right. Concern is not so much on uncertainty, but in coherence. What role do you think academia may play to shape more contextual acceptances, assessment practices, and tools?
Thanks, Willard, for the question. I think academia has a huge role to play. I think, and certainly one can see this from the work that Professor Kovacic Center, Competition Law Center at GW is doing with myself and Alejandro Ibarra and others in Latin America, and now we're beginning to work in Africa with certain fantastic countries. I think that the idea is that if enforcers and institutions are willing to engage, whether it's in an informal setting or not, and you astutely pointed out yesterday that informal toolkits are vital. I think we can really create a proper dialogue where academics may be able to help guide, provide normative considerations that might go otherwise unlooked. I think it's crucial that authorities are willing to not only stand up and say what matters or what works, to show that they're fantastic, doing brilliant things. I think it's important that there's true, real feedback. We're saying, you know what, maybe we got that wrong. Let's hear your perspective. And that's how institutions, how enforcers grow. And so I do think it's vital for that perspective. Do you want me to go on to the next question, or should we?
I think let's just keep going forward, actually, in terms of to while I integrate the questions
Right.
from outside.
So, I mean, in terms of, the question that you asked about the risks of laws, legal tests being too prescriptive or conversely too flexible, it's obviously a trite proposition that there are good reasons why competition systems seek relatively clear and administrable unilateral conduct rules. Predictability obviously matters for legality and business planning and for constraining entrenched economic power in consistent and transparent ways, particularly, I would say, in small or more concentrated economies where the levels of inequality may be incredibly high and concerns about self-perpetuating dominance and rent-seeking may be especially acute. But if legal tests become too rigid, overly prescriptive, authorities may struggle to address new forms of exclusionary conduct. And we certainly are beginning to have to grapple with that in terms of digital markets shaped by data advantages, network effects, and control over infrastructure. So I think the difficulty is that unilateral conduct enforcement regulates phenomena that are extraordinarily varied in their origins, manifestations, and effects. What happens where conduct lowers prices in the short term, but entrenches long-term dependency, or generates efficiencies while undermining innovation? Those are not questions that lend themselves easily to rigid or mechanical legal rules. So for me, the risk of excessively rigid legal tests is that they may create the appearance of certainty only by suppressing the underlying trade-offs that competition law is actually confronting. But I'd like to say that the opposite danger is equally serious. Once legal standards become highly open-ended, particularly where concepts such as fairness or broader public interest considerations enter the analysis, enforcement can become increasingly difficult to constrain and justify in principle terms. So at that point, firms may no longer understand not simply what the rules are, but what normative commitments are actually driving decision-making. So for me, the issue is not whether unilateral conduct enforcement should be rigid, should be flexible in the abstract. Some degree of flexibility and some degree of balancing is inevitable if competition law is going to truly engage seriously with the complexity of modern economic power. Once conduct may simultaneously generate competing forms of benefit and harm, institutions are necessarily required to make judgments about which considerations should prevail in particular contexts. And as lawyers, for those in the room, know administrative law and public law, more generally, balancing exercise are inherently contextual. The same conduct can be treated differently in different circumstances because the competing considerations differ. So the real challenge is therefore whether institutions can structure those balancing exercises in principled and transparent ways. If authorities can't articulate why one objective prevailed over another in a particular context, predictability begins to collapse, not because every case reaches the same outcome, but because the underlying reasoning no longer forms an intelligible body of jurisprudence. And that's why proportionality and a coherent normative framework become so important. They provide institutions with a principled way of structuring these trade-offs and explaining why particular considerations prevail in particular contexts. And I think, Willard, that's where academia can help and engage in these sort of trade-offs and discussions.
Thanks very much, Liat. It is important to seek to test the boundaries and the capacities, always in a situation where there is high community expectation as to the action and the effect of regulatory enforcement. And we have to, in essence, be weighing up these factors very aware of the consequence, which a number of our speakers have talked about, of the risk of doing nothing and the risk of not being sufficiently bold. Elisabetta, as Guillaume in fact had anticipated, you have experience and focus on interim measures. So I'm going to go to one of the questions. It's actually not yet there on, yes, it's the bottom on the screen, to ask you how important are interim measures in your jurisdiction, given that a wait-and-see approach may not be effective to curb unilateral conduct, and how in fact do you see that as a mitigant of the risks we've been discussing?
Yes, so thank you also to Anonymous for the question. It gives a possibility to share some thoughts on this. I think there's been a lot of discussion, and I'm sure there will be more discussion in the next months about the remedies that we apply when we find an infringement and we want to restore competition. And there has been a kind of increasing awareness about the fact that the kind of remedies that will suffice to restore competitions in traditional markets may not suffice to do so in digital markets. In particular, for many years in traditional sectors, it was sufficient as a remedy to mirror the abuse. So if the company was undertaking abusive tying practice, the remedy would be untie. If it was an abusive discriminatory practice, stop discriminating. No? So the cease and desist order would suffice to restore competition and imply that from the infringement moment onwards, competition on the merit was back on track. In fact, in digital sectors, we have come to realize that this may not be the case, and cease and desist orders may not suffice, because the firms may have accumulated advantage in terms of data or in terms of users, which in light of learning effects when it comes to data, and in light of network effects when it comes to users, may mean that they have, now at the point where it's very difficult for other firms to compete because of this advantage accumulated, also thanks to the abuse conduct. So this suggests, and this has been stressed also by Teresa Ribera in other occasions, and Guillaume, that it's very important to act fast before the damage occurs, and also, especially in digital sector, because of this complexity of restoring competition. Now, these kind of reflections come one-to-one with the fact that perhaps the next few years we'll also see more and more authorities making use of interim measures, precisely because they realize also that in these sectors, if you do not act fast, it's not going to be easy to restore competition later on. So at the Italian authority, we apply interim measures, I think, I wouldn't say often, but regularly. We did this year in the Meta AI WhatsApp case that we started, and the Commission is now looking at from a whole European perspective. We were very convinced that it was important to apply those interim measures, especially because it was a market, the artificial intelligence, generative AI, that is, we can't say nascent because it's just moving so fast that it's more than nascent, but where it's not yet been, the sort of the games and the positions of the different players is still not set. And there are many startups that have a chance to establish their business and offer good services to consumers. So it's very important to avoid abuse of dominant position in these markets. And with the same attitude, I'll say this, and we are also opening, we have opened a market investigation on quantum computing. You know, quantum computing is another rapidly expanding market, and the idea there was for us, again, these are markets which are likely to be playing a fundamental role in the coming years because of the capacity of quantum computing to solve complex problems, and this has implications and applications from AI to cybersecurity to fintech and so on. So you need to act fast, and in order to be predictable, effective, and accurate, you need to sort of also invest a lot in this knowledge to understand how market works, to then be able to act fast. And pursue anti-competitive conducts.
Thank you very much, Elisabetta. Now, Guillaume, we have a specific question for you and from the floor, and also I do want to come back to you referred to that you are soon to proceed to issue guidelines for the first time in relation to abuse of market power, and interested to hear in relation to that what you see as why now, what you see as the benefits and the objectives you're pursuing linked to predictability, but also the question for you is, and perhaps you will think about this in the guideline process, but what types of unilateral conduct would you think should be illegal without detailed assessment of effects? You may say none, but I'm going to be interested to hear what you think in relation to that question.
So maybe, I mean, you know, no long answer for me. I mean, there are two questions in your question, right? I mean,
Yes.
a specific one from Mr. or from Padillo, I don't know if that's the real name. What I had in mind, now obviously I can't disclose what will be in our guidance, but I think if you take stock of the case law, and that's why, you know, it's always important, all of that goes in parallel, you know, taking stock of judgments, taking stock of our decision practice and of the most recent developments. And I can think, you know, immediately of two behaviors that at least, you know, are meant to be or have been perceived by the case law as potentially harmful without going into many details. One is what we call naked restrictions. Remember the Intel case, you know, the long saga. There was one specific behavior where essentially Intel was paying, you know, distributors not to take competitors. You know, dominant company doing that, I don't know whether you need a very long theoretical analysis. I'm a practitioner. I would rather think that, you know, there's an impact that is not very positive, and I think the court agreed. Then you can think about the recent judgments in the sports cases. So I did one which was about ice skaters, and there was then in parallel the FIFA judgment about, you know, the behaviors by some organizations that have regulatory powers to act in a certain way that, you know, exclude competitors of their own competitions. I think the court didn't like that very much if it's not justified and so on. So these are two practical examples. You can have long discussions about that, theoretical or not. Practically, as a practitioner, I think it's good to think that these are not normal behaviors. So that's for my answer in you know, a practical one. As to the usefulness, and that, I think I don't want to develop for too long the usefulness of having guidelines in 102. I think first we can take stock of what has happened in other areas of antitrust enforcement in Europe. We have updated guidelines very regularly. Think about vertical guidelines where, you know, we have essentially updated guidance that were still very relevant in many respects, but what happened between 2012, 2022, 23, you know, the emergence of online distribution. So you have to review, to rethink, you know, your approach to selective distribution, exclusive distribution. This is one element. When it comes to market definition, you know, we updated our market definition notice, and that's relevant for abuse of dominance, but also for mergers, obviously. What did we do? We updated, in light of market realities, the way in which we conduct market definition. Think about digital markets, ecosystems. Think about sustainability. You know, for some people, sustainability is a parameter of competition, and you have to take it into account in your market definition. That is there, and that's based not on theory, that's based on very practical experience. And when it comes to 102, that's exactly the same approach. On the one hand, you need to have good foundations, good principles, but we have enforced 102 in the last 15 years quite actively. So we had guidance. I think that's a very interesting contrast. We had guidance on priorities in 2000, when was that, 2004? And that was, very academic and theoretical, sorry to say, to the extent that it was not really practical or practicable. It wasn't easy to enforce. And by the way, the cases we had were not really covered by this guidance because they were new market realities. So I think the impact of having 102 guidance now is first taking stock of what has happened. Think about the Google cases, but think about the pharma cases. There are many other cases, the ones I mentioned, so you need to take stock of that. You need to crystallize the state of play in light of the principles you have in order, to take stock and being principled, but also relevant, being relevant for companies and again for enforcers. And I think it has also, a big impact in Europe because we all work together within the ICN, applying the same law, 102, and having this mutual understanding within the ICN about how we tackle these cases. What should we be, providing details on the other hand, keeping some margin for flexibility is something very important. I think it makes us very strong. It makes us stronger because we have a common understanding on what should be done. So I think there are many aspects of the usefulness of 102. Think also about objective justifications. Think about efficiencies. A topic that goes in other instruments as well. I know that. And I think providing guidance on what we are likely to consider or not has some value. So flexibility is one thing, but being able to to give some perspective to businesses and customers on what how we approach things is fundamental. And then you need to update it from time to time, obviously.
Thank you. What I want to do at this point is to ask, as our final set of questions, for a quick reaction from each of you, and actually partly by referring to ECN, Guillaume linked into this, of how you see in this international environment a capacity for convergence, the value for considering coherence, I'm not going to say consistency, coherence, as against the context-dependent local experience. So I'll come around each of us, starting with Andy. And if you don't mind trying to do that in about 1 minute.
Okay, thank you, Dina. I think it's reasonable to say that I think a few jurisdictions in this room are more keenly aware than Taiwan and the TFTC of the how challenging international cooperation and conversion can be, given the predictable political headwinds we frequently encounter. But still, given that we are deeply rooted, deeply committed to engaging in cross-jurisdiction dialogue and cross-pollination, because we know very well the benefits from cross-agency cooperation and sometimes convergence of rules. So I think there are several benefits which has been mentioned in academia or in the practice community. The international harmonization of rule, especially prescriptive rule, might create the enforcement environment, transparent enforcement environment, which might be beneficial for multinational companies. And also international cooperation and harmonization might avoid the possibility or incentive to engage in foreign shopping. And by creating a uniform rules for unilateral conduct, I think it is also could significantly reduce the operational cost for business because we standardize the process for legal compliance. But that said, I think we still need to be mindful of the limits of the international cooperation. I think market condition, level of technology sophistication, and also industrial competitiveness vary widely from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So a global mandate of uniformity might create the danger of the enforcement being over-deterring in some contexts and under-deterring in some others. So I think this is the reason why both in our white paper and the policy statement for generative AI, we focus on while we emphasize the importance of international engagement and harmonization, we also emphasize the need to pay attention to local nexus of any enforcement efforts. So by doing that, I think our enforcement could remain effective, relevant, and capable of maintaining the competition in the market within our borders. I think that's the point I want to make. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Liat, I know you will not be in favour of really prescriptive rules, but interested to understand whether you think there's an opportunity for convergence.
Yeah, right. Some degree of convergence I certainly think is both desirable and probably unavoidable in the global economy. There are obvious benefits to regulators exchanging expertise, coordinating investigations where appropriate, and developing common analytical tools, or call it broad normative principles, particularly for smaller jurisdictions. But I think we should distinguish between convergence at the level of broad norms and convergence at the level of concrete outcomes. At the level of broad norms, convergence is relatively achievable precisely because most abuse of dominance systems are articulated at fairly high levels of abstraction. So there's significant conceptual overlap across jurisdictions regarding concerns from exclusionary conduct, leveraging of market power, foreclosure, etc. But once one moves from those abstract norms into concrete application, divergence becomes much more difficult to avoid and perhaps should not always be avoided. Markets differ enormously across jurisdictions. Economic concentration differs, institutional capacity differs, developmental priorities and historical trajectories differ. And I think this is particularly evident in, visible in my own continent, Africa. And certainly if you look at the regional systems and such as the fantastic COMESA and the broader African continental trade area project, member states differ enormously in terms of economic structure and institutional realities with very different market conditions. So more fundamentally, competition law systems do not also all pursue identical objectives. Some jurisdictions may place emphasis on issues such as economic inclusion, structural inequality, dependency, or resilience because of their own constitutional, political, or developmental histories. South Africa is obviously is an obvious example. And I think that matters because convergence ultimately requires at least some overlapping consensus about what competition law is trying to achieve. Otherwise, harmonization risks becoming a mechanism through which certain jurisdictions effectively export their own normative priorities onto others. So my own view is that regulators should probably aim for principled coordination rather than substantive uniformity. And I certainly think that there's real value in shared analytical tools, institutional dialogue, procedural convergence, and cooperation in enforcement. But systems also need sufficient flexibility to respond meaningfully to local market conditions and domestic normative commitments. And I certainly think that the ICN is a spectacular arena for these sort of dialogues to happen also on an informal level.
Thank you. Going to give each of the remaining speakers about 30 seconds to give a quick thought.
Well, I is it working? I think so. So I just want to say that I heard here in the panel the tension and the need to be coherent instead of predict or flexible. But I think the tension is real. I think we should choose the sides we stand in. I think that where you are, you can be coherent and predictable or flexible, but you can be also predict and also give certainty, because when you give certainty to the market, the firms find a way to do what harm competition, and it's not on your list. So we must be very cautious about it. This is our role to protect competition, to protect consumer, to find this harmful behaviors and to enforce them and to deter companies. But I must say that all of us are maybe asked to for greater business certainty, but not all of us are in the same place. I think each regulator decides or how he wants to enforce with regard to the economy that he oversees. Like in Israel, we are very concentrated economy, and we must choose. I know as a head of authority what side I should choose, but in different economies with fewer competitive problems, I think the pendulum can be in another place. So it depends on the economic and the competitive situation, and things can change between agencies. Thank you.
Thank you. Guillaume. Go to Elizabeth.
Yes, I think I can speak for Guillaume a little bit when I say that the cooperation that works within the ECN, the sort of European National Competition Authority, is extremely fruitful. And I think it really helps to combine the objective of being coherent in applying the European law with the objective of being effective. So we have a lot of action coming from national competition authorities, but we are coordinating it in such a way that the law is applied in a coherent way. And of course, as the Italian authority, we strongly believe also in the ICN network. That's why we dedicated so many resources in being acting as anchor agency. We think cooperation is extremely fruitful and is useful to build that analytical framework and make it common. But it doesn't need to go all the way to unanimity. There are national differences both at market level and at policy objectives, and we need to respect those. So we're working on this.
Yes.
Yeah, 10 seconds. Markets are not uniform, legislations are not uniform, we all know that.
Yes.
And yet you can see, practices that are the same by, actors having global presence, and yet the markets are still national. I think Nathalie earlier in the, discussed food markets, for example. So we have to have a common understanding of what these practices are and discuss and understand, how we address them. And if there are differences, okay, and I think that's the meaning of, cooperation. We have that in the ECN, and the EU is very, sees the value of international cooperation, and the ICN is the first example of that. If we don't discuss these issues that are very often common, we had this panel on food prices, they are common to everyone, And if we don't understand each other and what the differences may be, I think we're not as efficient as we should be. So if we want to be efficient, effective, we have to understand each other. That's the very meaning of international cooperation generally, but of the ICN in particular. So I think it's good to remind everyone of the value of that cooperation.
Absolutely agree. This has shown that this is a topic which has, both from the audience and from the panel, generated much discussion and many different possible approaches. We can all see, and the previous panel, in fact, each that we had yesterday, showed the importance of cooperation in terms of sharing what we observe, sharing data, and sharing the possible methods and analytical approaches to address. And where possible, particularly in relation to global conduct, to be able to strike the same level of approach, seriousness, and desire for effective response to global conduct interfering with competition. It has also opened up the ability within a principles-based framework to reach particular economic, jurisdictional dependent results and actions within that principles-based framework, and having shared in the manner of this discussion a real debate about the risks and the benefits. Thank you very much to the audience for giving questions, and to the panel for responding in a very real-time way to the questions that we received as well, and for all your contributions. Please thank them.
Thank you very much to our moderator and speakers for that insightful discussion. We would like to request for everyone to please stay center stage so that we can have a photo op for this particular session. Can we give them another round of applause, please? Today's session reminded us of the delicate balance required in enforcing unilateral conduct rules, ensuring clarity and predictability while remaining flexible enough to respond to evolving and complex market realities. We're going to have our next sessions coming up very, very soon, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to have a very quick coffee break before proceeding to breakout sessions 2 and 3. Please take a look at the screen. We will have the schedule as well as the different locations for the different sessions on screen. Please take a look. Make sure that you know where to proceed for the breakout session that you have signed up for. The next breakout session will start at exactly 11:15. So please keep that in mind. Lunch will be served at 12:45 at the Delegation Hall, MGBX. Once again, that's 12:45 at the Delegation Hall, MGBX. That's located at the lower ground floor. We would also like to remind everyone that breakout sessions 3 will commence promptly at 2 p.m. Let me remind everyone of the different times. 11:15 is when breakout sessions 2 will start. 12:45 is lunch. Breakout 3 is at 2 p.m. We look forward to seeing everyone here at 4 p.m. for the AWG Plenary. Again, as you are exiting, please take a look at the screen for the different schedules of breakout sessions and the locations. We highly recommend that for this quick coffee break, that you grab the coffee, your refreshments, and take it with you to your next breakout sessions, which will commence once again at 11:15. And with that, good morning, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day. And I'll see you back here at 4 p.m. Thank you.